Hi, December the 3rd and we've had a cover in the snow. On December the 1st I was at Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre where Andrew was giving one of his winter restoration tours of Lancaster NX611. This keeps you up to date with what's going on with the restoration of Lancaster NX611 Just Jane. If you go into my channel and look for the playlist, in it you'll find winter restoration tours of Lancaster NX611 Andrew Panton. There are 20 videos covering most of Andrew's restoration tours, starting with 2016, the paint strip. It's a quick way to find out what has gone on and what is going on with the restoration. Thanks for watching.
My talk about the restoration. My name's Andrew Panton and I'm effectively the manager of the restoration of the Lancaster and the centre here as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the project to restore the Lancaster to airworthy condition and what we're doing to get to that end. Has anybody been or not been to East Kirkby before? Is it anybody's first visit? Very good. Has anybody not been on a restoration tour before? Okay. Good. So, well, I will give a little bit of a recap then about the restoration work, the project, everything like that. So for those of you that have been before, my apologies, because I'm going over old ground for you. But for those of you that are new and fresh to it, hopefully I can give you enough information about where we are and why we're where we are, so that everything else starts to make sense when I go forward. Okay, so this is Aviation Lancaster NX611. It's a Mark 7 Lancaster built in April 1945. And this is owned by the Panton family, and it was purchased and the centre was set up as a memorial to Christopher Panton and All Bomber Command. Christopher Panton was lost flying on Halifaxes during the Second World War on the Nuremberg raid, which was the raid that had the highest losses of British aircrew and Allied aircrew during the Second World War. So with it being purchased as a memorial to them, it was moved here just in a static condition. Obviously owned then by Fred and Harold Panton in memory of their brother, and the centre was set up around it. And really from that point on it snowballed. So when it was brought here in a static condition, everyone was asking, are you going to get it running? So they decided, well, let's work out if we're going to get it running, starting with one engine, working through to eventually having all four engines running. And then it's running, are you going to get it taxiing? So then the next step was to get it taxiing. And once it was taxiing, of course, everyone was then asking, are you going to make it fly? So the aircraft became taxiable for the general public in about 1995. And then in 2009, Fred went on the radio and made the decision that we were going to get the aircraft airworthy. So from 2009 to about 2015, we were really sourcing parts, getting engines overhauled, and putting the groundwork in place to start the restoration of the Lancaster itself. 2016 we did a complete paint strip of the Lancaster and survey to work out then how we were going to make the aircraft airworthy from that point. So from that point when we did the paint strip, we worked out a 10-year restoration plan, starting off with the parts that we knew were potentially the worst, to eventually make the whole aircraft airworthy. Our biggest problem with the restoration of the Lancaster is the aircraft has to taxi during the summer period to raise the money to spend on it during the winter periods of restoration. So when we first started the restoration period in the early years, so years 1, 2, 3, we started on parts that we could unbolt in the autumn, restore over the winter, bolt back on in the spring to taxi with for another summer period, and then take off another part the following winter. So we started with tail fin and rudder on one side, and then removing some parts for inspection, and then the following year we did tail fin and rudder on the opposite side, removing other parts for inspection. Then we did wingtips, and then we started on thinking, crikey, now we've got the little bits off, we've got to start taking really big bits off. Can we get those big bits of work done in the 5 months over winter to be able to taxi again? So that made us really think outside the box as to how can we approach this project to keep the aircraft taxiing, to raise the funds to spend on it, to also restore it to airworthy. So a bit of a catch-22 situation. So we eventually came around a way of thinking of something that would actually benefit Lancasters worldwide as well as benefiting our project. And the way to do that was to borrow parts from other Lancasters and other Lancaster projects, restore those to a taxiing condition, fit them to NX611, take our part off, restore our part to airworthy, and then swap it back again. So the first time we did that was the rear fuselage section. So the rear fuselage here you'll see has got NX611, which is this aircraft, and KB976 serial numbers on it. So KB976 was a Canadian Lancaster, or Canadian built Lancaster, that was owned by a gentleman called Charles Church. He was having it restored to airworthy, but the hangar that the work was being done on actually collapsed on the aircraft and broke the aircraft back. Some girder parts of the hangar collapsed through the centre section of the aircraft and also the tail section. So this part of the aircraft here was pretty much destroyed. On top of the aileron behind you there is a photograph, or should still be a photograph, laminated. If someone would like to pick that up and start sending it around the group for me, please. That shows the rear fuselage condition when it came here to East Kirkby. So the rear fuselage from this transport joint backwards is off KB976, and that's been lent to us by the South Yorkshire Air Museum at Doncaster. So you'll see on that photograph how much of it was basically destroyed in the hangar collapse, what we've had to make here to get us back to a good taxiing condition. So that came to us. It'd been used for a film called Night Flight, so some film prop department had made it usable for that filming, but none of that work had been done to any sort of a condition that was good enough to taxi with or to hold any weight. So when it came here, it went into our rear fuselage jig, which we'd built using our rear fuselage, so we knew the jig was good and would fit our aircraft. We fitted KB976's rear fuselage onto the jig and then started to repair it to a taxiing condition. And this rear fuselage was fitted last winter. So this time last year, we were taking off our rear fuselage and bolting on the rear fuselage of KB976. So that started the ball rolling with this borrow apart, restore it, fit it, take our part off, restore it, swap it, and get it back. So the benefit to the South Yorkshire Air Museum is they get a good piece of fuselage back, which they can display, do something interactive with, perhaps have people walk through it. The benefit to us is that we get another year of taxiing, raising funds to then spend on our piece of fuselage or piece of aircraft that's being restored. The worst thing for us would be to have to completely stop any operating of the Lancaster, because it's no longer raising funds from people like yourselves coming to the museum, people having a ride on it. Everything grounds to a halt. We don't then have the funds to pay the engineering staff to restore the aircraft. So with the rear fuselage having worked, so when we got this here, we found the transport joint on that rear fuselage was actually bent. So there was great concern actually when we found that, whether we could actually put it back into the proper shape for it to marry it back up to NX611's fuselage and all the 240 holes line up. Thankfully for us, we did manage to actually get it back how it should be. So when we did marry it up to NX611's fuselage, it did fit and all the bolts went in. So I guess testament to the engineers doing the work and the jig as well, because it's proved its worth that it can actually work to get everything true to how it should be. So with that example showing that the process works, we started on other things we could do as well. I got in touch with a group over in France at the Bourget who have Aviation Lancaster NX611, which is another Mark 7 Lancaster, and that, like this one, was built towards the end of the war, never saw wartime service, but was used by the French Naval Air Force, La Naval, and did a lot of work out in the Pacific. This aircraft survived it and came back and was flown back from Australia. NX611 didn't survive it. It had a bad taxiing landing accident which damaged the undercarriage, collapsed the undercarriage, and one wing went down, hit the ground, hit the runway, and the aircraft spun. So the French just left it there. So it was there on Wallis Island where it had the accident. A lot of locals threw things at it. It suffered quite a lot of damage over there. And then when they actually decided to bring it back to France, it was taken apart on Wallis Island, put on barges, and it probably went through 7 or 8 different ships and barges before it eventually got back to France. So it also suffered a lot of damage in that transport as well. But we thought if there's parts of NX611 that the French team haven't already restored, but we could borrow, restore and fit. They benefit from getting a part back that's restored. We benefit from being able to taxi another season and do the work on our aircraft, raising the funds obviously to do the work. The biggest hurdle for us here at East Kirkby was the wings. So the outer wings run from just here, so you can see the big gap in the wing, run from there to where the wing is clipped at the moment, where the wingtip fits on. So we knew full well that doing a wing would take far longer than a winter period that we would have. And we also knew that the French team hadn't done anything to their wings at all. So their port wing was complete and didn't touch the ground. The starboard wing did touch the ground, and when we inspected it, it bent the spars inside the wing. So we thought if we can start with the port wing of the aircraft, we can build a jig, fit their port wing to the aircraft, restore it to taxiing, swap it out with our port wing, fit our port wing to the jig, restore it to airworthy, and of course bolt it back on. And then we could take the port wing back to the French, pick up their starboard wing, bring it back, do the same process again, and then take their starboard wing back to them. The French organisation are quite a small outfit. They've done work to the cockpit and nose, some of the fuselage as well, but obviously the wings is a massive project, and for their small team it would be an awful lot of work for them to actually achieve restoring their wings. So obviously us offering to do that, they were quite keen to get on board with us and work with us the best we could to benefit both parties. So we went and we did collect the port wing. I will take you down to the restoration area, but we are planning on fitting the NX611 port wing to this aircraft this winter period and taking our port wing off. So in order to facilitate that, there's a lot of stuff we have to take off the aircraft to get the wing off. So if we look at our outer wing here at the moment, this is the wing section that will be restored to airworthy, taken off the aircraft this winter and restored. It's also the section that we will go down and have a look at the jig to see the French wing in. So to come off this, we have the trailing edge comes off. The trailing edge bolts on all those studs you can see there. I haven't counted them, so if anybody feels inclined. So those studs basically, they're double-ended bolts for want of a better description. So they go through the spar, the top boom and the bottom boom with a nut on the end. So the nut's on the inside of the wing. You offer up the trailing edge spar and trailing edge. It slips over the top of those studs, then you put a nut on this end. So in order to take the trailing edge off, you undo a nut off each of those studs, and then the trailing edge just parts from the wing. You also have to take off the wingtip, which is just here at the moment. So our wingtips are now airworthy, both port and starboard wingtips have been done. So the wingtip sat in this fixture here. You have to take off the undercarriage valance, so that's kind of the side wall of the undercarriage bay and the door. That has to come off purely because it covers up some heads of some screws that you have to remove to get the wing off. Take the outboard engine off. So you'll see the Merlin engine in the engine stand over there. So that's from the number 1 position just here. So that has to be removed, and the propeller which is underneath the bomb bay, and then the subframe has to come off which sits behind the engine. So the subframe basically takes the stresses of the engine and routes them back through the wing to make sure everything stays together, for want of a better description. So you see the subframe is quite a wacky tubular design, and that's obviously all done to offlay the stresses through the wing. So the engine is connected to the subframe by 4 bolts, and the subframe is connected to the wing by 3 bolts. At some point we'll find something where it goes down to 2 bolts and then down to 1 bolt. So the subframe, if you can see the wing, so see the 2 bits hanging down at the front of the wing there, that's where the subframe bolts to, and then if you follow the red triangle back, there's a mounting which is now removed at the back of the wing, which is where the back of the subframe bolts to. So with those removed, we now have the wing in a position where you just have to remove the fuel tank, which sits up inside this section here. There's a little panel here, so the fuel tank has to come out, and then we'll trestle the wing, undo the 8 big bolts and the other smaller bolts, and remove the wing from the aircraft. So the next process for us now is to jack the aircraft and trestle it. So the big jacks go underneath the wing. We'll lift the tail up to more of a flying attitude to get the aircraft stable, and then we'll try these big bolts here just to see if they turn. So the big bolts that you can see go through the wing spars. The wing is made up in that it has 4 spars, so a top spar and a bottom spar, both front and back of the wing, so front spar and rear spar. And between those two spar booms is what they call a web, so it's a sheet of aluminium. So as we look at the back of the wing here, we're looking at the web. All those studs and bolts are going through the spar boom, top and bottom, and that's mirrored on the front of the wing as well. So it's creating effectively a box section. You've got the rear spar, the front spar, and then between those spars are a set of ribs running obviously fore and aft from inboard to outboard, and we'll have a look at those out on the wing that's being restored at the moment. In doing, so the big benefit from doing the French work, not only are we being able to taxi the aircraft during the summer again with the French wing fitted, but we're also learning an awful lot about how the wing is made and how is best to restore it. The wing, Lancaster wing, hasn't been taken apart and put back together again since Lancaster's stopped production, so mid-1940s. So the French wing there is the first wing in, anybody good at maths, almost 80 years to have been rebuilt. So with that, obviously there's no template, no guide really as to how to do it. So we had to kind of learn as we went along. We built a jig looking at the structure of the wing, thinking what do we need to hold on to in that wing to keep it rigid so we can start taking parts off, and they're a guide as to where these parts need to go back again when we rebuild the wing. So that fixture's down in the engineering there. From doing the French wing, we found out how we should have done it. So the jig down there is going to have to be changed somewhat to actually do the wing in a reverse way of how it was built in the factory. So by taking that wing apart, we found out it was actually built completely differently to how we expect it to be built. And I'll go over the building process when we're down with the wing. But what we've learned from doing the French wing has meant that our wing will probably take half the length of time to restore it than it would have done had we just set about our wing restoration on its own. So the port wing is going to be fitted this winter along with our trailing edge and our wingtip to enable us to restore our port wing. So this will go in the jig and then be restored, and they say starboard wing will come back and we'll do the same again on the starboard side. Another thing we're doing this winter with the French is the use of their nose. So the nose is from the cockpit panel forwards. So if you look at the Just Jane nose art, if you were to cut her thigh bone in half, from that point forwards is the nose of the aircraft, and from that point backwards is the cockpit of the aircraft. So we've borrowed the nose from NX664 to do the same again. So we will be fitting NX664's nose, taking NX611's nose off, restoring it to airworthy and swapping them back out. So if you look towards the fire engine there, just this side of it, the black structure is the nose of NX664. So we'll walk that way. When you look at the Lancaster, you can see what's called the transport joint. So the transport joint is basically where two major sections of structure, fuselage or wing, are bolted together, and that basically shows where the individual aircraft sections were built separately before being bolted together as an entire structure. So if you cut through the centre of Just Jane there, you can see the join there of the transport joint, so that's where the nose bolts on. So the nose of NX664 as it came looks like this. So they've done a certain level of restoration to it to make it look cosmetically fairly good. So there's quite a lot of damage which has actually been filled with a filler, like a body filler on a car, and there's also quite a lot of damage inside in formers and things which they hadn't repaired. So when the nose section came to us, it's basically a case of doing a complete paint strip, replacing skins and also repairing formers inside, so that it's in a good safe condition to taxi with. So once we've jigged the aircraft to be more level, put it up on jacks and lowered it down as far as we can, we will undo all the bolts that hold the nose to the cockpit and draw the nose section away. The most complex part of the nose section here for its removal has actually been all the systems inside. So it looks like they were produced in two sections for the ease of production, bolted together and then fitted out inside. So there's not a lot of quick release connections for pipes or junction boxes for wiring between the two sections, which is what I'd hoped to be the case, because then you could just disconnect everything and draw it away. But it looks like actually it was bolted on, and then all the cables are running, all the pipes are running. So we've had an awful lot of systems to remove between the cockpit and the nose to allow us to actually draw the nose off. When we fit NX611's nose, we will just fill it with the things that we need to make it good to taxi with, and also to make it look more complete inside for the person's experience when they're having a tour or a taxi ride on board. So things like the bombing computer, the bomb sight, the camera equipment will all go back into this to make it look more complete than just the bare shell. So inside the nose, you've got various things that are kind of integral to the cockpit and really required for taxiing. So the big pneumatic bottle sits just behind the turret inside the nose. That pneumatic bottle, of course, feeds the pneumatic brakes. So we need that to be refitted to be able to use the brakes on the aircraft. All the braking system is fitted inside the nose, so cables run from the cockpit and from the pedals down into the nose to the brake valve and all the valves and gears and cogs within there to make all the brakes work. So that's all going to be taken out and refitted into the new nose. There's a lot of pipe work for the hydraulics for the turret, some of the controls that come from the cockpit into the nose, then back through the bomb bay. So they use the nose to transition through. So all that's got to be removed to enable the nose to come off. So it's not quite as simple a removal as I'd hoped it would be, but obviously it's required to take the nose off to restore it. The biggest parts of restoration work for us as a team here are going to be the cockpit and the centre section. So the cockpit bolts onto the centre section just behind the wireless operator square window, so just behind the leading edge of the wing. So the cockpit comes off as a section, leaving the centre wing box, for want of a better description of it. So when we come to do the cockpit and the main centre section there, I fully expect that we're actually going to have to stop taxiing the Lancaster for a year or two. The restoration of somebody else's part to taxiing condition is only good for us when the restoration of that part costs less than the funds we receive by continuing to taxi the Lancaster. When that balance changes so that we're spending more money on somebody else's part to facilitate us to raise less money, then there's no point doing it. So I suspect when we get to the cockpit and centre section, because of the sheer volume of systems within those parts, we're going to have to just stop taxiing the aircraft, restore our parts, finish the project, and then have an airworthy Lancaster. So those will be the last parts to be done. So looking further forward in the project, once we've finished the port wing, whilst we're doing our nose section, we will also be working on another French fuselage section, which will be the rear mid section. So that's where the middle part of the aircraft meets the rear fuselage part. So if you'd like to follow me down to the restoration area, if anybody's bored, feel free to leave. This is a good opportunity because I won't notice. So we'll go down towards the restoration area.